It needs to be crystal clear that emergency response is a distraction. It is irresponsible to pretend that the risk of an explosive oil or chemical derailment can be managed. The DOT's Emergency Response Orange Book tells firefighters to retreat, evacuate a 1-mile blast zone, and let it burn for days or weeks, because those types of fires are so hot that they cannot be extinguished. Our communities will be impacted for decades. We must focus instead on prevention.
Glenn, you've been a community advocate for rail safety and policy reform since 2011. Are you more concerned now? And if so, why?
I'm more than concerned. I'm scared. And everyone on this Zoom has good reason to also be scared. That is because the kind of rolling stock failure we saw in East Palestine could happen anywhere in our region, and Pittsburgh is the prime candidate for the next epic derailment. Pittsburgh sits right smack in the middle of the most intensively used rail car for transporting volatile oil and hazardous chemicals in North America. We all talk about exploding oil trains because each oil train car is the equivalent of 2 million sticks of dynamite. Every year, 2.8 billion, that's with a B, gallons of the most explosive Bakken oil come right through Pittsburgh on Norfolk Southern's most critical rail line, which supplies 50% of that most explosive type of oil being refined on the East Coast. That oil is explosive because it contains extremely flammable propane, methane, butane, and ethane. Those gases can be removed before the oil is loaded onto rail cars, but that interferes with Norfolk Southern's profits. As a result, the risk is offloaded to communities along the rail lines. But the other real danger is the deadly chemicals that are carried on every rail line in this county. We also saw how that played out in East Palestine, and that train was on its way to Pittsburgh and then to a New Jersey plastics plant. Because of that, we must view East Palestine as one big fiery alarm bell. Allegheny County had 77 hazmat rail events over the last 10 years, according to Council Member Erica Strasburger. Besides vinyl chloride, however, train cars often carry 180,000 pounds of chlorine gas under pressure. If a chlorine rail car is punctured, it will take only 10 minutes for that deadly gas cloud to escape. That cloud is heavier than air and will kill everyone in Pittsburgh. You can't simply evacuate a city in 10 minutes, and that is not an exaggeration. Norfolk Southern is really playing Russian roulette with us. With each passing train, there's a spin of that gun's cylinder. We're just all dodging bullets. We have all been just plain lucky.
You've been warning about and basically predicted an East Palestine type of derailment. What else makes you say Pittsburgh is especially primed for a catastrophic derailment?
Well, bridges are rail line's most vulnerable point, and Pittsburgh and Allegheny County have an abundance of poorly rated, privately owned rail bridges. As you heard, Norfolk Southern's response is always that the rust is merely cosmetic or aesthetics, until it's not. And then you get a Merchant Street Bridge crisis. The issue is not whether the many hundreds of poorly rated rail bridges pass inspection now, but how many will be in such a severely corroded condition in the next 2 to 10 years that they will have to be replaced? And the bigger question is, how big is that bill going to be for us taxpayers? Next, there are also hundreds of quote, naked at-grade crossings with no gates or warning lights, like the one that resulted in the Harmer derailment last fall and almost took out the entire city's water supply. Norfolk Southern needs to spend the money to protect their crossings, given the extremely hazardous nature of their cargo. Also of major concern is the antiquated water drainage systems all along the tracks in our city. They are overwhelmed by record rainfalls from climate change. That results in supersaturating the soil under the ballast, which then shifts and will take the rails out of alignment. Finally, all through Pittsburgh, there are 4 to 6 foot diameter water and sewer lines directly under the rail lines that are over 100 years old, hand-laid brick, and the mortar has been degraded by acid rain. These all need to be reinforced or replaced before the volume of rail traffic per day is going to more than triple. The collective vibrations of that traffic will collapse the subsurface utilities. Really, when you realize that radioactive liquid natural gas by rail is in our near future, you understand that rail infrastructure and regulatory reform need to happen starting now. Understand that 22 rail cars of LNG have the equivalent explosive force of the Hiroshima bomb.
So what's your response to Norfolk Southern saying they don't want a derailment?
Well, I can believe Norfolk Southern said they don't want derailments, but they keep having derailments. Their actions speak louder than their words. If Norfolk Southern really didn't want derailments, they would not have fought regulations requiring safer electronic brake systems for over the last 50 years. They did that because it impacts their profits. While they may not want a derailment, I know what they want more. And that is giving an $18 billion stock buyback to their shareholders, hitting record profits for the $55 billion corporation, and giving obscene bonuses to their CEO, who already earns $8 million per year. Derailments for this company are just a cost of doing business.
We keep hearing about Norfolk Southern and precision scheduled railroading, or PSR. What is that?
It's a new business model that has prioritized on-time departure and arrival over everything else.
And what's happened because of this new business model?
Well, PSR resulted in a 40% staff cut, and that includes locomotive engineers, maintenance, and inspectors. According to various whistleblowers, that cuts the time in the rail yards that locomotive engineers have to do safety inspections before the train leaves the yard. Typically from 3 minutes per car, depending on the rail yard, down to 30 to 45 seconds per car. And they keep adding cars to the length of the train. Worse yet, there's proof that yard managers are telling engineers to forego inspections altogether, even on hazardous trains, so that the train leaves on time or they get chewed out by their bosses. And PSR has changed how train cars are assembled before they leave the yard, and that has safety risks. We saw how that grab and go process of adding any cars in the yard to the train that were ready resulted in a more serious derailment in East Palestine, where heavier cars were built into the train behind empty cars. And when you step on the brakes, you get an epic derailment. In terms of getting to the destination at the almighty scheduled time, Norfolk Southern has a written policy that managers can override an alarm generated by a hot box, which is what detects a wheel bearing failure. And this alarm is what told the train to finally stop too late in East Palestine. So ProPublica asked the other 6 largest rail companies if they had such a policy. 4 said no. One of the 4 said no one can or should ever disregard a stop the train alarm. 2 others didn't respond.
What effect does their new business model have on infrastructure?
Well, you know, with such drastic cuts in the maintenance and inspection workforce, all types of rail infrastructure suffers. Like, what could possibly go wrong? The FRA report into the 2018 Southside derailment said it all. Serious oversights in maintenance and inspections related to an old, worn plug rail that cracked. Norfolk Southern has no real incentive to maintain its bridges because when they become unsafe, Norfolk Southern relies on taxpayers to provide 70% of the funding to give them a new bridge.
There's a chemical burn-off from a derailment in Allegheny County. Could we rely on the Allegheny County Department of Health?
Well, not as it's currently operating. First, the current acting director is not a scientist or a medical professional. He was a politician. The ACHD is underfunded. It's not equipped to measure all of the necessary toxic chemicals that would be released. It has done a poor job of holding polluters to account, and it has an abysmal record in terms of communicating with residents who are suffering from health impacts of pollution.
Elected representatives in Pennsylvania feign being helpless when dealing with railroads. What have other states with high volumes of rail traffic done to protect their residents?
Well, note that California, New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, Washington, and Oregon all have laws that Pennsylvania needs, which are expressly permitted by the Federal Oil Pollution Control Act of 1990, known as OPA. That number 1, impose strict liability in the event of a derailment involving an oil spill or explosion for all property damage, health costs, lives lost, and require the restoration of natural resources and permit punitive damages. Number 2, OPA allows states to impose fees on oil landed or transferred into the state once it comes off a rail car. This was never even challenged by the railroads in California. In terms of oil spill response planning, it covers more than just a plan. It allows requiring training equipment, communications equipment, and qualified officials to coordinate with the first responders. It also requires cleanup. In court challenges, the railroad argued that if a federal standard exists, they are exempt. The states got around that exemption by passing laws of general applicability to all industries, covering the health and safety of all citizens. States and local governments share authority with the feds to enforce federal safety standards, and they can conduct inspections which are paid for by rail industry assessments. Federal laws relating to oil spills are just the floor, and states can require more. Moreover, states can regulate where the government has failed to do so. City and state governments can control what new infrastructure gets approved within their borders. Even local municipalities can deny land use permits for expansion if they find improper safety risk or improper mitigation under state statutes. Finally, states are also allowed to ensure that a railroad is financially responsible, either through insurance or the posting of bonds. Pennsylvania has none of these protections for its citizens, and no appetite to provide any of these safeguards, because the rail and petrochemical lobbies have our elected representatives eating out of their hands. That must change. But there is some hope. Let your state representative know that you want these protections. There will be a link in the chat to find contact information for your representative.
Who are our adversaries in the rail battle?
Well, I'll say that Norfolk Southern's general counsel was the former head of the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the agency that is investigating Norfolk Southern's Ohio derailments. I can share more if you are interested during the Q&A.
Can you highlight some of RP3's past and current successes?
Well, through administrative proceedings at the PUC and court injunction proceedings, including three years of mediation, RP3, along with two other neighborhood organizations, delayed Norfolk Southern's vertical clearance project for 4 years. That resulted in a significant monetary settlement for impacted communities. Currently, RP3 is working with multiple teams of national journalists, including the Wall Street Journal, and film crews working on either a rail risk or policy reform expose. We're providing advice to our governor, 3 state senators, and the U.S. Senator Casey. We are effective because of your voices, as you can now better appreciate contributing your grassroots voice works. We will post the link in the chat to our latest missive about closing Rail Safety Act loopholes, which we hope you will sign and disseminate to your networks. Mayor Gainey signed on, and Pittsburgh City Council passed a will of council that adopts our action items and commits to using the FAST Act to inspect and to try to get a head start on repairing infrastructure.
So what would make you more comfortable?
Well, let me summarize the risk. An explosive derailment in Pittsburgh risks not only its 300,000 plus residents, but the city's most critical infrastructure, which is all within 1 mile of the blast zone, including 3 stadiums, the convention center, both NRG power plants, telephone switching stations, 6 major hospitals, 124 public and private schools, 5 universities with a combined enrollment of 75,000 people, 77 bridges, which only includes bridges in the city of Pittsburgh and owned by Allegheny County. 6 nursing homes with a total bed count of 920 people. Our major museums, which hold national treasures, and 108 parks. So we just cannot take all the risk, while Norfolk Southern takes all the profit. In light of that, what would make me more comfortable is if our state and federal legislators stop taking so much money from the petrochemical and rail lobbies and did their jobs, which is to protect people instead of polluters. If we don't get a handle on this right away, what you will have is a Norfolk nightmare coming soon to a neighborhood near you.
Where can people learn more about rail safety, policy reform, and other action items?
On our website, Rail Pollution Protection Pittsburgh, we are providing a link to that in the chat. In addition, we ask that you sign our Close the Rail Safety Act Loopholes petition, which is going to the US Congress on May 3rd. Earlier, I mentioned some reason for hope on the state level. So we are also including a link to PA House Bill 939, which will help properly fund Pennsylvania Utility Commission's Department of Rail Safety Inspectors and help pay a competitive salary to keep them employed. Let your state rep know that you support this bill. We are including a link to help you connect with your elected representatives. Finally, you should know and support Pennsylvania House Representative Abigail Salisbury. I think she's on this Zoom, who is pursuing some accounting in connection with Norfolk Southern's relying on taxpayer funding to maintain or to pay to replace Norfolk Southern's privately owned bridges that have not been maintained throughout Pennsylvania, and offloading those costs instead to municipalities like hers in Swissvale. As you saw firsthand, right after the crash at East Palestine, Norfolk Southern's extreme arrogance and utter disregard for people is what drives our grassroots campaign. Never underestimate the power of a community that stands together. We all deserve power without pollution and energy without injustice.